All right, let's dive into something really interesting today. We're going deep into Pakistani religious politics with Mariam Abou Zahab's Pakistan, a Kaleidoscope of Islam. This book really gets into the thick of it, exploring the forces shaping this fascinating country.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Abu Zahab really digs deep. It's not just skimming the surface. She takes us right to the heart of what's going on. And one of the most insightful things she does is, introduce this idea of the Jhang paradigm.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. For those of us who haven't had a chance to dig into the book yet, what exactly is the Jhang paradigm?
Basically, it's this framework she developed, right, to help us understand how sectarianism grows, particularly in the context of Jhang, which is a city in Punjab province.
Yeah.
But it's much bigger than just one place. It gives us a lens to look at these broader dynamics of, religious and social conflict across Pakistan.
So it's not as simple as just religious differences.
Right, exactly. Abu Zahab makes a strong case that sectarianism really thrives in these environments where, you have a lot of social and economic frustrations bubbling under the surface, especially among groups who are striving for more but feel held back by elites from another ethno-religious community.
So it's about power, resources, who gets what, and I imagine a sense of being left behind.
Exactly. Think of it like a pressure cooker, right? You've got these groups with tons of ambition, a desire for a better life, but they feel blocked, like the system is rigged against them. And oftentimes, religion becomes the language they use to express those frustrations, the banner they rally under.
And Abu Zahab herself is a pretty fascinating figure. I mean, it's not every day you meet a French scholar who converts to Shiism and then embeds herself in Pakistan, even going so far as to interview leaders of Sunni supremacist groups.
It's pretty incredible. That personal journey definitely gives her writing this unique perspective, but the impressive thing is how she weaves it into her analysis without, sacrificing objectivity.
That's what makes her work so compelling.
Yeah.
So she uses this Jhang paradigm to explain the rise of groups like the Sipah-e-Sahaba, Lashkar-e-Taiba, all of that.
Exactly. Like, take the SST, for instance. They popped up in Jhang in the middle of all this, social and economic anxiety, particularly among Sunni Muslims who felt pushed aside by the Shia elite. The SSP tapped into that, channeled all those frustrations into this, potent and, to be honest, incredibly dangerous form of Sunni supremacy.
And then there's Lashkar-e-Taiba, the LGT, probably one of the most infamous jihadist groups out there.
Yeah.
How do they fit into this Jhang paradigm?
See, the Letty T is interesting because they've taken this whole idea of appealing to the marginalized and turned it into this fine-tuned recruitment strategy. They focus on educated youth, often middle class, who feel disillusioned, by the powers that be, both religious and political. And what the Letty does is offer them this sense of purpose, of belonging, something bigger than themselves.
So it's not simply a matter of poverty or a lack of opportunity. There's this deeper sense of disillusionment that they're tapping into.
Absolutely. They offer this alternative path, right? This chance to be part of something bigger, to achieve a kind of spiritual and social mobility they don't see anywhere else. And within that whole framework, the promise of martyrdom becomes a powerful motivator, especially when you combine it with how they justify suicide missions as this necessary tactic in their fight against whoever they perceive as the enemy.
It's chilling, honestly, how they can twist ideology to justify that level of violence. Speaking of which, how did Pakistan's history, events like the Soviet-Afghan War, play into the rise of these militant groups?
Oh, the Soviet-Afghan War was absolutely a turning point. It basically became this breeding ground for a whole new breed of militant, one fueled by this potent mix of, ideology, geopolitical interests, and, let's be real, easy access to weapons and training. It was also during this time that you saw conservative Sunni groups like the Deobandis, who historically focused on education and social reform, start to, morph into these more militant neo-fundamentalist movements.
And events like the demolition of the Babri Mosque in India probably didn't help matters.
Oh, absolutely not. It just poured fuel on the fire, inflamed religious tensions across the entire region, and it gave these groups this incredibly powerful narrative for recruitment, portraying Muslims as under attack, in need of defenders,
So we have this really complex web of internal and external factors, all kind of converging to create this perfect storm for militancy in Pakistan. But before we get too far ahead, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another region that's key to understanding all of this. The Federally Administered Tribal Areas, or FATA. How does the Jhang paradigm apply to this region?
Well, the FATA, with its own unique history and social dynamics, offers this really compelling case study. You see similar patterns of marginalization, the rise of groups who are striving for power, but it all plays out within the context of tribal structures and power dynamics. You have the Kashars, these individuals who are challenging the traditional tribal elites, often using religion as a tool to gain support and legitimacy.
So in a way, it's another example of how this Jhang paradigm can help us untangle the complexities of religious politics in Pakistan.
Precisely. Whether it's the rise of the SSP in Jhang, the Let's See recruitment strategies, or what's happening in the FATA, this framework helps us connect the dots, see how things like socioeconomic grievances, religious identity, and political opportunism all intersect to create this, well, this breeding ground for militancy.
And the FATA, like you said, has its own unique set of challenges. The influx of Afghan refugees during the Soviet-Afghan War must have really added another layer of complexity to an already complex situation.
It did, definitely. I mean, that war had this ripple effect across the entire region, you know? But yeah, when we zero in on the FATA, you have to remember, this is a region already struggling, right? Poverty, limited access to education, not a lot of resources, and a history of being, well, let's just say neglected by the central government. And then suddenly, boom, you've got this massive influx of refugees, all needing help, all with their own traumas and struggles. It created this kind of pressure cooker environment ripe for exploitation by groups with, shall we say, less than noble intentions.
And that's where groups like the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, enter the scene, right? They
Yeah.
used all that chaos and instability to their advantage.
Exactly. They were able to tap into those existing grievances, promising things like order and justice, even though it was through this, extremely harsh and extremist interpretation of Islam. And don't forget, that porous border between Pakistan and Afghanistan worked to their advantage too, gave them a safe haven, a base of operations.
It's almost like these crises, they become opportunities for these groups to grow, to spread their influence. But it's not always just about violence, is it? I mean, Abou Zahab also talks about how groups like the Lati, they've engaged in these social welfare activities, especially after that devastating earthquake in 2005. It's this weird dichotomy. They're ruthless militants, but also sometimes compassionate aid workers. How do you make sense of that?
Well, honestly, it's a pretty clever strategy, even if it is cynical. Think about it. You're in a community that's just been shattered by an earthquake, right? The government, well, they're slow to respond, as governments often are. And then all of a sudden, these guys show up in the Lati, and they're providing food, water, shelter, you name it. They're filling the void, building trust. And in doing so, they're subtly shaping people's perceptions.
It's a way of building legitimacy, showing people they're not just about destruction. They care, they help, right?
Exactly. It's about winning hearts and minds, plain and simple, creating an environment where their ideology can take root. And it makes it a lot harder to push back against them because who wants to be seen as criticizing a group that's, on the surface, helping those in need?
It's a messy situation, that's for sure. And it kind of highlights this larger point that Abu Zafar makes. Sectarianism in Pakistan, it's way more multifaceted than we often give it credit for. It's not just this simple Sunni-Shia binary that we often see in the news.
No, not at all. And to reduce it to just the, Sunnis versus Shias, it misses the nuances, the complexities of what's really happening on the ground. I mean, yes, sectarian violence between those two groups is real, it's tragic, but it's often fueled by a whole bunch of factors like political maneuvering, competition for resources, and I guess you could say, the spread of this more intolerant, hardline interpretation of Islam.
Right, and let's not forget the role of madrasas in all of this.
Yeah.
Some of these religious schools, particularly the ones that are promoting this more rigid, inflexible interpretation of Islam, they seem to be playing a part in keeping this cycle going.
It's true, but it's important to not lump all madrasas together. Plenty of them provide essential education, especially in poorer areas where access to public schools just isn't there. The problem comes in with the ones that are actively promoting intolerance, teaching this very narrow and exclusionary way of looking at the world.
So it's not necessarily about religious education itself, but how it's being taught, the messages that are being emphasized, right?
Exactly. When you have young people who are only exposed to one very rigid interpretation of their faith, and on top of that, they're being taught to view anyone who believes differently with suspicion or even outright hatred, well, it's not hard to see how extremism can take root in that kind of environment.
Especially when you combine that with a lack of opportunity, a sense of being left behind by the system, right? Like your voice doesn't matter, so why even try?
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it. You're a young person. You've grown up in poverty. Your access to education and employment, It's extremely limited, right? You feel like the system is rigged against you. Then suddenly you encounter a group that offers you this sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, this opportunity to fight for something that feels bigger than yourself.
It's a powerful narrative, especially when you frame it in a religious context. It offers meaning, purpose.
It does, and that's exactly where the danger lies. These groups, they offer certainty in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and unjust. They take complex questions and give these simple answers, and they offer this path to redemption, even if that path is, well, paved with violence.
So how do you break that cycle? Abou Zahab doesn't leave us completely without hope, does she? I mean, there's some glimmers of hope in her analysis, right?
Mhm.
So how do you break that cycle? Abou Zahab doesn't leave us completely without hope, does she? I mean, there's some glimmers of hope in her analysis, right?
Oh, absolutely. She's careful to point out that, these extremist groups haven't managed to radicalize the entire population or anything like that. I mean, most Pakistanis, no matter their sect, they just want peace and stability like anyone else.
That's good to hear, at least.
Yeah.
But how do you counter those really seductive narratives, right? I mean, these groups offer these simple, appealing solutions to what are really complex problems. It's hard to compete with that.
Well, education is a good place to start. And I don't just mean religious education, but like a more well-rounded approach, something that encourages critical thinking, tolerance, and just a more nuanced understanding of Islam in general.
So giving young people the tools to question things, to engage with different viewpoints, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Just imagine a generation that can actually break down these extremist narratives, see right through them. A generation that understands the historical and social context that these narratives are being used in. That right there, that's a powerful way to combat extremism.
And Abu Zahab is also pretty critical of the government's role in all of this, right? Like she argues that they need to be tackling the root causes of this extremism, not just the symptoms.
Yeah, she doesn't let them off the hook. And she's right. Tackling things like poverty, inequality, that lack of opportunity, that's essential. When people feel like they have a real stake in society, when they can actually see a path to a better future for themselves, well, they're a lot less likely to be swayed by these extremist ideologies.
So it's about creating a more just and equitable society overall, one that opens up those opportunities for everyone, not just a select few.
Exactly. Good governance, making sure the benefits of economic growth actually reach everybody. That's what it comes down to.
And maybe, just maybe, if Pakistan can find a way to create that kind of society, one that truly values and embraces all its citizens, it can finally break free from this cycle of sectarian violence and create a more hopeful future.
It's a huge challenge for sure, but one that Pakistan can't afford to ignore. The stakes are just way too high.
Well, Abu Zahab's book has certainly given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. It's a good reminder that if we want to find solutions, we have to be willing to understand the complexities. We have to look at the historical forces at play, the socioeconomic factors that contribute to extremism. It's complicated.
It really is. It's about going beyond those surface level headlines, you
Yeah.
know, looking past those simplistic narratives and really grappling with the nuances, the gray areas. And ultimately, I think it's about recognizing that if we want a more peaceful and just world for everyone, it's going to take a real commitment to dialogue, to understanding, to addressing the root causes of these conflicts. There's no other way.
Well said. And for anyone listening who wants to dive deeper into this topic, and we've just scratched the surface here, I highly recommend checking out Mariam Abou Zahab's Pakistan, A Kaleidoscope of Islam. It's a challenging read, but definitely worth it.
Couldn't agree more. It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finish it, makes you question your assumptions, and I think it pushes you to engage with this really important issue in a more informed, more nuanced way.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into Pakistani religious politics. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey, and we hope you'll tune in again for our next deep dive into, well, a new and equally fascinating topic. Until then, take care.